The rain in the Pacific Northwest doesn't just fall. It intrudes. It seeps into the bones of the trees, into the asphalt, and eventually into your own mind. I had been driving for 6 hours straight. The rhythmic, hypnotic. The price was absurdly, comically low. A foreclosure, the listing agent had stammered over the phone, eager to get it off his books. It needs work, he had said, his voice tight. And it's remote. Very remote. Are you sure you don't want to see it in person? The sudden absence of the Jeep's rumble made the silence of the woods crash down on me. I sat there for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, just looking at it. The house was massive, far larger than the grainy online photos had suggested. It was 3 stories of dark, peeling wood and asymmetrical gables. The roof sagged in places, like a spine buckling under an immense weight. The windows were tall and narrow, black and reflective in the gloom. They didn't look like windows. They looked like eyes, flat and indifferent, watching me sit in my car. A wraparound porch encircled the ground floor, its floorboards warped and rotting. A chill crawled up my neck. It wasn't the cold air. It was a primal, deeply ingrained biological response. The lizard part of my brain, the part that kept my ancestors from walking into caves that smelled of predators, was screaming at me to put the car in reverse and drive back to Seattle. "Don't be an idiot, Artie," I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice startling me in the quiet. "It's just an old house." I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat, popped an umbrella, and stepped out into the freezing mud. The rain was a fine, freezing mist now. As I walked up the porch steps, the wood groaned beneath my boots, a long, agonizing sound that seemed to echo for too long in the surrounding timber. I fumbled with the heavy brass key the agent had sent me. The lock was stiff, protesting with a harsh metallic screech before giving way. I turned the handle and pushed the heavy oak door open. A smell hit me immediately. It wasn't the smell of decay or rat droppings or stale air, the things you expect in an abandoned house. It smelled strangely clinical, like ozone, like the metallic tang in the air seconds before a massive lightning strike. Beneath that, a subtle scent of dried lavender and something else I couldn't quite place, something sour, like copper, like blood. I stepped inside and found the light switch on the wall. I flipped it. To my genuine surprise, a dusty chandelier in the center of the foyer sparked to life, casting a sickly, jaundiced yellow light over the entrance hall. I closed the door behind me. The heavy thud severed the sound of the rain outside completely. The silence inside the house was absolute. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. The foyer was grand but decaying. Peeling floral wallpaper, dark red roses on a beige background curled away from the walls in long, desperate strips. A grand staircase swept upward into the darkness of the second floor. To my left, a set of heavy pocket doors led into what I assumed was the parlor. To my right, a long, narrow hallway stretched toward the back of the house. As an architect, the first thing I do when I enter a building is map its geometry in my head. I look at the load-bearing walls, the flow of space, the proportions. As I stood in the foyer of the Blackwood House, a strange sense of cognitive dissonance washed over me. The hallway to my right? It was too long. Based on the exterior footprint of the house I had seen from the driveway, that hallway shouldn't be able to. A large bay window looked out over the backyard, a chaotic tangle of dead thorns and towering pines that backed up against a steep, rocky ridge. I spent the next 2 hours unloading the bare essentials from my Jeep, a sleeping bag, a cooler of food, a lantern, and a bottle of cheap bourbon. By the time I had dragged the last load upstairs, the woods outside had been swallowed by absolute impenetrable blackness. There were no streetlights, no glow of a distant city, just the void. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the bare mattress, unscrewed the cap on the bourbon, and took a long, burning pull. The liquor warmed my chest, dulling the sharp edges of my anxiety. I sat on the edge of the bed, the battery-powered lantern casting long, grotesque shadows against the walls. It was 9 p.m. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the drive and the weight of the past 2 months, but sleep felt miles away. I lay back on the sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling. A water stain in the plaster above me looked remarkably like a face, a man screaming, his jaw unhinged. I closed my eyes. Just sleep, Artie. I don't know how long I drifted. It could have been 10 minutes, it could have been 2 hours, but I was jolted awake by a sound. My eyes snapped open. The lantern had died, plunging the room into total darkness. The rain was still drumming against the glass, but the sound I heard was inside the house. It was coming from the floor beneath me. Thump, thump, thump. It was heavy, deliberate, and incredibly slow, like a bowling ball being dropped onto the hardwood floor of the parlor over and over again. I froze, holding my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I strained my ears, listening to the dark. The house was settling, I told myself. Old wood expands and contracts. It's normal. Thump, thump. It wasn't the house settling. It was a footstep, an impossibly heavy footstep. I slowly sat up in bed, my hands blindly searching for the heavy metal flashlight I had brought with me. My fingers brushed the cold aluminum casing, and I gripped it like a weapon. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my boots hitting the floor with a soft thud that I instantly regretted. The heavy thumping downstairs stopped instantly. Silence rushed back into the house, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was expectant. It was listening. I sat there in the dark for what felt like an eternity, sweat beading on my forehead despite the freezing temperature in the room. Whoever or whatever was downstairs knew I was awake. They knew exactly where I was. Slowly, agonizingly, I stood up. I clicked the flashlight on. The harsh white beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty floorboards. I walked toward the bedroom door, wincing at every microscopic squeak of the floor. I gripped the cold brass doorknob, took a deep breath, and pulled it open. The hallway was a tunnel of black. I shone the flashlight down toward the grand staircase. The beam caught the dust motes dancing in the air, but nothing else. I crept down the hall, my back pressed against the peeling wallpaper. When I reached the top of the stairs, I aimed the beam down into the foyer. Empty. The chandelier hung motionless. My duffel bag sat exactly where I had left it. "Hello?" I called out. My voice was a weak, trembling croak. "I'm armed. I have a gun." It was a lie, but it was the best I could do. No response. I began to descend the stairs, the flashlight sweeping back and forth between the hallway and the parlor doors. When I reached the bottom, I realized the pocket doors to the parlor, which I distinctly remembered being closed when I arrived, were now cracked open about 3 inches. A sliver of pure, absolute darkness waited behind them. I walked toward the doors, my knuckles white around the flashlight. I raised my foot and kicked the heavy wooden door open. It slid back on its track with a harsh, grinding noise. I swept the light across the room. Old furniture covered in yellow dust sheets. A massive fireplace clogged with old ash. A grand piano sitting in the corner, its wood warped and cracked. There was nobody there. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A raccoon, maybe? Or a drifter who had squatted here and fled when he realized the new owner had arrived. My rational brain was desperately trying to build a dam against the rising tide of panic. I turned away from the parlor, ready to march back upstairs and lock the bedroom door. But as I swept the flashlight back toward the kitchen hallway, the beam caught something on the floor. I walked closer, crouching down. There, in the thick layer of gray dust that coated the hallway floor, were footprints. But they weren't the prints of a boot or a shoe or even a bare human foot. They were large, circular indentations, spaced roughly 3 feet apart, dragging a deep groove through the dust between them. It looked as though someone had walked down the hallway carrying something impossibly heavy, or worse, as if something with blunt, stump-like appendages had dragged itself from the back of the house, stood in the foyer, and then dragged itself back into the dark. And the trail led directly toward the heavy iron-reinforced door at the end of the hall, the door that led down into the basement. I stood up, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The smell of ozone in the air suddenly grew sharply, sickeningly stronger. From the other side of that basement door, I heard a sound that made the blood in my veins turn to ice water. It was a wet, rattling gasp, the sound of something drawing a long, shuddering breath of air into lungs that hadn't been used in a very, very long time. And then a voice, rasping, metallic, and impossibly deep, whispered from behind the wood. "RT." It knew my name. The sound of my own name, uttered in that gravel pit rasp from behind the basement door, did something to my physiology. It wasn't just fear, it was a total systemic rejection of reality. My fight or flight response didn't just kick in, it exploded. I didn't make a conscious decision to run. My legs simply acted, propelling me backwards so hard I nearly cracked my skull against the opposing wall of the narrow hallway. I scrambled up the grand staircase, no longer caring about the agonizing groans of the rotting wood beneath my boots. I was a primal animal now, fleeing a predator that knew not just my scent, but my identity. I reached the second-floor landing, my breath coming in ragged, tearing gasps that burned my throat. I bolted down the hall to the master bedroom, slammed the heavy oak door shut, and fumbled frantically with the deadbolt until I heard the satisfying metallic click. It was a pathetic defense. If whatever was downstairs could mimic human speech and drag itself around with that impossible weight, a piece of brass wasn't going to stop it. I knew that, but I needed the barrier. I needed to not see the hallway. I dragged the heavy dresser, the one I had planned to chop up for firewood, across the floorboards. It screeched in protest, a sound that seemed to vibrate right through my teeth, but I didn't stop until it was firmly wedged against the door. Only then did I allow myself to collapse onto the sleeping bag, the flashlight rolling from my trembling grasp and casting an erratic beam across the ceiling. I sat there in the dark, my back pressed against the cold mattress, listening. Artie. How did it know? The agent? Elena? No, that was impossible. I hadn't told a soul in Oregon my nickname. To the real estate world, I was Arthur. To Elena, I had been Artie, usually said with fondness, later with exasperation. Hearing it here, in this rotting sarcophagus of a house, felt like a violation of the only private space I had left, my memory. I tried to construct a rational explanation. Sleep deprivation, the stress of the divorce, high altitude. No, I wasn't high enough for that. The mold, some toxic spore in the wallpaper causing vivid auditory hallucinations. Architects knew about sick building syndrome. This place was the definition of it. It had to be that. It was the ozone smell. It was affecting my neurochemistry. I gripped the whiskey bottle I'd left by the sleeping bag, unscrewed the cap with a hand that refused to steady, and took a massive gulp. The liquid burned, but it didn't soothe. It just made the edges of the room seem to warp slightly in the flashlight's dying beam. The rest of the night passed in a kind of waking coma. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the old timbers was a threat. Every moan of the wind outside was that voice, ready to whisper my name again. The heavy thumping didn't return, and for that small mercy, I was grateful. But the silence was worse. It was heavy, like the air inside a sealed tomb. It was a listening silence. Dawn didn't arrive with a burst of sunlight. It was a slow, agonizing transition from total black to a bruised, sickly gray that filtered through the grime of the bay window. I sat up, my muscles screaming in protest, my head pounding with a dehydration headache that felt like a spike through my temples. With the daylight, a thin veneer of logic returned. The monsters of the night always seem ridiculous in the morning, right? I needed to think about load-bearing walls, foundation stability, electrical currents. I needed to treat this like a renovation project, not a ghost story. I removed the barricade from the door, the screech of the dresser against the floorboards echoing uncomfortably in the hall. I gripped the aluminum flashlight, my knuckles white, and pulled the bedroom door open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the gray light. The cold air had settled, making me shiver violently. I walked to the staircase and descended slowly, my eyes locked on the front door. It was still locked. The windows in the foyer were unbroken. I forced myself to walk down the kitchen hallway. My heart rate spiked as I neared the basement door. I stopped 10 feet away. The gray dust on the floor told the story. The drag marks were there. They started near the parlor doors, marked by those large indentations, the blunt stumps, dragging a wide groove behind them. They led directly to the basement door, and there they stopped. There were no marks leading away. The lock was stiff, protesting my departure, but I wrenched it open and burst out into the freezing Oregon morning. The rain had stopped, but the air was wet and thick with mist. The woods around the house seemed to lean in, the parasitic moss hanging like shroud cloth. I jumped into the Jeep and peeled down the driveway, the tires throwing up plugs of mud. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, 30 miles away. The logging town of Oak Haven was a depressing collection of rusted metal roofs and shuttered storefronts huddled against the forest like a wounded animal. I found a diner that looked marginally open, a place called the Sawdust Kettle. The neon sign in the window sizzled and sparked, illuminating the grimy glass. I walked inside. The smell hit me instantly. Grease, stale coffee, and the pervasive scent of damp wool. 3 old men in flannel jackets sat at the counter, their heads turning in unison to watch me enter. The waitress, a woman named Barb according to her name tag, was wiping down a table with a rag that looked older than I was. "What can I get you, honey?" she asked, her voice like sandpaper on wood. "Coffee," I rasped. "Black, lots of it." I took a booth in the back. The red vinyl cracked and taped together in places. I needed to blend in. I needed to look like a guy who was just passing through, not a man whose house was trying to communicate with him. Barb brought the coffee. It was lukewarm and tasted like burnt dirt, but the caffeine was a necessity. I sipped it, watching the old man at the counter. They had turned back to their conversation, but I could feel their eyes flicking toward me in the mirror behind the bar. "You the guy who bought the Blackwood place?" The voice startled me. One of the old men at the counter had turned around on his stool. He was ancient, his face a road map of deep wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue. I hesitated. Denial was tempting. "I bought a property out on the old logging road," I said cautiously. "Blackwood," the old man nodded, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Price was too good to be true, wasn't it?" The other 2 men chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Barb stopped wiping the counter and looked at me, a look of genuine pity in her eyes. "We don't get many strangers buying out that far," the old man continued. "Usually people just leave it be." "It's remote," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's what I wanted." "Is it?" The old man leaned forward. You know why it sat empty for 30 years, son? Foreclosure wasn't the half of it. The bank couldn't even get inspectors to stay out there for more than an hour. My heart was doing gymnastics in my chest. I took another sip of the burnt coffee. Why's that? People talk, Barb interrupted, sliding onto the bench opposite me. You shouldn't listen to all the gossip in a town this small, Artie. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Artie. She saw my reaction. Oh, honey, I'm sorry. I saw your name on the credit card listing when you bought that chainsaw a few days ago. The manager at the hardware store is my cousin. We all know each other here. I let out a shaky breath, a tidal wave of relief washing over me. Barb knew my name. It was just small-town gossip. She had told the old men, and maybe one of them had a cruel streak and had hiked out there to mess with the new city guy. It's fine, I said, a genuine laugh bubbling up from my chest. It was the best sound I'd heard in months. Just caught me off guard. The tension in the diner seemed to evaporate. I was no longer the mysterious stranger. I was just Artie, the fool who had bought the haunted house. Barb smiled, revealing a missing tooth. The old men turned back to their coffee. Just be careful out there, Barb said, her voice softer now. Old houses, they have ways of settling that can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone. I nodded, feeling a newfound confidence. Barb was right. It was psychological. Small-town gossip, stress, and a sick building. I was going to be fine. I spent the next few hours in Oakhaven, stocking up on supplies. I bought actual food this time, cans of chili, bread, fruit. I bought extra batteries for the lantern. I bought a better lock for the front door. I was taking control. By the time I drove back out to the Blackwood property, the mist had cleared and the sky was a bruised, ominous purple. The house didn't look like a gargoyle anymore. It looked like a structure in need of significant renovation. My architecture brain was fully engaged. I was analyzing sight lines, window placement, roof gradients. I parked the Jeep, grabbed the groceries, and walked up the porch steps. The groan of the wood didn't sound like an agonizing moan this time. It sounded like warped floorboards. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell of ozone was completely gone. The house smelled musty, old, and damp, which was entirely appropriate. I carried the groceries to the kitchen, humming a tune I hadn't realized I knew. I set about cleaning the kitchen counters, scraping away 30 years of grease with a satisfying fervor. I spent the day working. I patched a leak in the parlor roof with some tar I bought. I scraped peeling wallpaper from the kitchen hallway, revealing the dark, aged plaster beneath. I felt a sense of ownership, a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since Alina left. As darkness fell, I moved upstairs to the master bedroom. I set up the lantern, opened my sleeping bag on the bare mattress, and settled in with a bowl of chili and the bourbon bottle. It was 1 a.m. when I finished the chili. I was tired, but not terrified. The house was quiet, a different kind of quiet. It felt peaceful. I lay back on the sleeping bag, staring up at the water stain on the ceiling. Just a water stain, Artie. Just physics. I closed my eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. Wait, I was awake. I didn't know how long I had been asleep. The lantern had died. The room was total black. There was no thumping downstairs. The silence was back, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of the afternoon. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of the previous night. And then I heard it. A new sound. It was coming from inside the walls. Skitter, skitter, scratch. It was high-pitched, metallic, and rapid, like claws on wood, inside the plaster, right behind the headboard of the bed. I froze, my body breaking into a cold sweat. It was just mice. Old houses have mice. Architects know this. Skitter, scratch. It moved down the wall, toward the floorboards. It moved with an impossible speed, a rapid, skittering crawl that seemed too purposeful for an animal. It moved around the perimeter of the room, inside the walls. Skitter, scratch. It stopped right next to the bay window. And then A sound from above me, from the attic. It was the heavy thump, the sound of a footstep. Thump, thump. It moved across the ceiling, directly over my head. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate. The voice rasping in the basement was terrifying. Barb knowing my name in town was a relief. But this, the thing in the walls and the thing on the ceiling, they were interacting. They were coordinated. The skittering inside the wall intensified, moving faster, desperate, claws shredding the aged plaster. And above, the thumping footsteps matched the pace. Heavy, crushing, vibrating the dust from the ceiling onto my face. And then the smell returned. It wasn't just ozone now. It was the sharp, metallic tang of copper, and beneath it, a scent that made my blood run cold. It was the scent of dried lavender and the faint, unmistakable aroma of Elena's perfume. The scent of bergamot and cedarwood hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. It was Elena's perfume, Santal 33, a custom blend she had worn every single day of our 7-year marriage. It was the smell of our pristine, glass-walled apartment in Seattle. It was the smell of the collar of my trench coat after she hugged me. It was the scent that lingered on her pillow for weeks after she packed her 3 immaculate leather suitcases and walked out of my life, leaving a silence in her wake that I had sought to replicate in this godforsaken woods. But here, in the freezing, absolute darkness of a rotting farmhouse 30 miles from nowhere, the smell wasn't a comfort. It was an obscenity. It was a violation of the highest order. My architectural, rational mind, the mind that spent its life calculating load-bearing walls, tensile strengths, and spatial dynamics, shattered like dropped glass. You can rationalize an old house settling. You can rationalize the wind sounding like a voice. You can even, if you try hard enough, rationalize small-town gossip feeding your subconscious paranoia. You cannot rationalize the fresh, overwhelming scent of your estranged wife's custom perfume manifesting in a sealed, abandoned room while something impossibly heavy thumps on the ceiling and something impossibly fast skitters inside the walls. The house wasn't just haunted, it was mining me. It was reaching into the hollow spaces inside my chest and dragging out the things that hurt the most, weaponizing my own grief against me. The skittering in the plaster beside the bay window suddenly stopped. A split second later, the heavy, deliberate thump. I didn't bother pulling the dresser back. I'd moved it earlier. I gripped the brass knob. It was ice cold, so cold it seemed to burn the skin of my palm. I threw the door open and stepped out into the second-floor hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the walls around me. It wasn't a sound you hear with your ears. It was a sound you feel in your sternum. It was the sound of millions of tons of pressure grinding against itself. I looked to my left. At this end of the hall, there was a narrow, unassuming door painted a fading, chipped white. The door to the attic. Unlike the impossible corridor to my right, this door was exactly where it was supposed to be, merely 10 feet away. The thumping had come from the attic. The logical, survival-driven part of my brain screamed at me to run down the endless hallway, to try and reach the stairs, to flee the house and never look back. But the architect in me, the man who needed to understand the structure, who needed to see the foundation of this nightmare, took over. If the house was manipulating space, if it was projecting my grief into physical architecture, I needed to see its brain. I needed to see the top floor. I walked toward the white door. Every step felt like I was wading through waist-deep water. The air was freezing, my breath pluming in white clouds in front of the lantern's beam. I grabbed the knob of the attic door, turned it, and pushed. It opened with a mournful creak, revealing a steep, incredibly narrow flight of wooden steps leading up into absolute blackness. The smell of copper was overpowering here, smelling exactly like a handful of pennies soaked in blood. I began the climb. The stairs were steep, the treads barely wide enough for my boots. The walls of the stairwell pressed in close, scraping my shoulders. With every step, the temperature dropped. Frost began to crystalline on the wooden paneling around me. When I reached the top, I pushed open the heavy trap door and hoisted myself into the attic. I held the lantern high, sweeping the blinding white light across the space. The attic of the Blackwood House was massive, running the entire length and width of the structure. The roof sloped sharply upward, supported by massive, raw-hewn timber beams that looked like the exposed spine of a leviathan. There were no windows. The air was stagnant, heavy with decades of undisturbed dust. Unlike the lower floors, which were littered with the debris of past, failed renovations, the attic was strangely organized. In the center of the vast, cavernous room, illuminated by the harsh glare of my lantern, sat a massive, antique oak drafting table. My breath caught in my throat. I approached it slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, kicking up clouds of dust that danced like frantic ghosts in the light. The drafting table was angled upward, complete with a rusted brass T-square and an old, dried-up inkwell. And pinned to the center of the board, yellowed and brittle with extreme age, was a set of architectural blueprints. I set the lantern down on the edge of the table and leaned over the drawings. They were the floor plans for the Blackwood House. In the bottom right corner, in elegant, sweeping cursive, was a signature, E. Blackwood, Master Architect, 1892. I traced my fingers over the faded blue lines. The ground floor layout was there, the parlor, the kitchen, the long hallway. The second floor was there, the master bedroom, the child's room with the rocking horse. But as my eyes moved across the paper, a cold horror began to bloom in my gut. These weren't the plans of a house meant for living. They were the plans of a trap, a labyrinth designed by a madman. According to the blueprints, the walls of the house were double-layered, with narrow, 2-foot-wide service corridors running between every single room. Corridors with no doors leading into the main house. Corridors meant only for skittering. I looked closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. The staircase I had climbed yesterday didn't align with the second floor. According to the drawing, the stairs fed into a blank wall, while a secondary, hidden staircase bypassed the second floor entirely, leading straight from the basement to the attic. But the most terrifying feature was in the dead center of the house. Where the grand foyer and the parlor intersected, the blueprints showed a massive, empty cylinder dropping straight down from the attic roof, through the second floor, through the ground floor, and deep into the earth beneath the basement. It was a structural impossibility. A house built around a void. In elegant, deliberate lettering, E. Blackwood had labeled this central void the Hollow. I stumbled back from the drafting table, bumping into a large object hidden beneath a dusty canvas tarp. "There is a hollow inside of you, Artie." Elena's words echoed in the cavernous space of the attic, mixing with the smell of her perfume. But the grief, the desperate, hollow yearning that had brought me to this forsaken place anchored me to the spot. I unlatched the brass buckles. They popped open with a crisp, modern click that sounded deafening in the 1890s attic. A massive, towering silhouette detached itself from the gloom. It didn't have a distinct shape. It looked like a mass of architectural debris, broken beams and rotting wallpaper fused together into a towering, shambling pillar of ruin. At the bottom, where feet should be, were blunt, heavy stumps. It took a step forward into the flickering lantern light. Thump. The scent of bergamot and cedarwood was replaced instantly by the overwhelming, gagging stench of wet ozone and rotting copper. From the center of the towering mass of debris, a slit opened. It wasn't a mouth, it was a tear in the fabric of the thing. And from that tear, Elena's voice emerged. But it wasn't her voice filtered through a phone or a memory. It was her voice layered over the deep, grinding, metallic rasp I had heard through the basement door. "We found the hollow, Artie." The monstrous, dual-layered voice vibrated through the attic, and it is so hungry. The wooden hand in the suitcase gripped the leather edge and began to pull something else up from the ash. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my eyes wide with a terror that transcended sanity, searching frantically in the strobing light for the trap door that led back down to the impossible hallway. But as I looked at the floor behind me, I realized the trap door was gone. There was only solid wood. I was sealed in the brain of the house, and the architecture was closing in. The trap door was gone. I traced my hands frantically over the rough, freezing floorboards where the entrance had been just moments before. My fingernails dug into the grooves, searching for a seam, a hinge, any break in the geometry. Nothing. The wood was solid, unbroken, and ancient. Skitter. Skitter. Scratch. The sound was deafening now, echoing off the massive timber spine of the roof. In the flickering, dying light of the dropped lantern, I finally saw them. They poured from the shadows at the edges of the attic, things that defied description. They looked like grotesque parodies of architectural elements given terrible life. A cluster of what looked like rusted iron nails fused together into a jagged spider-like form, dragging itself across the floor. A segment of floral wallpaper, stiff and curled, moving like an enormous, erratic centipede. Thousands of tiny splintered wood fragments acting as legs. They were the scavengers of the house, the maintenance crew of the hollow. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the spot where the trapdoor used to be, my eyes darting wildly. I was trapped between the skittering horde and the towering, shambling pillar of debris that spoke with my dead wife's voice. Thump! The pillar took another step. It was easily 9 feet tall, its mass shifting and grinding, old plaster, shattered glass, and rotting wood suspended in a terrifying, unseen magnetic field. The tear in its center pulsed, and the dual-layered voice, Elena's sweetness wrapped around the metallic rasp, spoke again. "Don't be afraid of the foundation, Artie. It's just geometry. We just need to measure the space you left behind." From the suitcase full of ash, the wooden hand pulled a second object. It was a skull, but it wasn't human. It was formed entirely of compacted gray dust, its jaw hanging open in a silent scream. I turned and ran. There was nowhere to go but the instinct to flee overriding logic. I ran toward the far wall of the attic, away from the drafting table and the nightmare assembling itself. I slammed into the wooden paneling, feeling the icy frost bite into my skin. I hammered my fists against it. "Let me out!" I screamed, the sound tearing my throat. "Let me the hell out of here!" The house responded. The floor beneath my boots suddenly pitched downward at a sickening 30-degree angle. I lost my footing, sliding backwards across the dusty boards. I clawed at the wood, trying to arrest my momentum, but the floor was slick with the unnatural frost. The lantern, still flickering, slid past me, plunging the far side of the attic into strobe-lit chaos. The angle of the floor steepened. 45 degrees, 60 degrees. The laws of gravity were warping alongside the architecture. I was sliding toward the center of the room, toward the area Blackwood's blueprints had labeled the Hollow. "Artie!" The voice boomed, no longer Elena's, but the deep, grinding roar of the basement. The pillar of debris was sliding too, its massive weight causing the floorboards to scream, but it seemed to control its descent, using its blunt stumps to brace itself. The center of the attic floor simply vanished. Where solid wood had been, a massive, perfectly circular void opened. It was a cylinder of absolute, light-devouring blackness, exactly as depicted on the drafting table. It was the throat of the house. I scrambled desperately, my fingernails tearing on the splinters, but the incline was too steep. I slid over the edge. I didn't fall. The physics of the hollow were non-Euclidean. Instead of plummeting downward, I was pulled inward, sideways, as if the gravity had suddenly shifted 90 degrees. I tumbled through the dark, surrounded by the rush of freezing, ozone-scented air. It felt like falling down a massive, frictionless slide. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the void. I hit a surface hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. I rolled, gasping, and came to a stop against a cold, smooth wall. I was no longer in the attic. The flickering light of my lantern, which had fallen in with me, illuminated a space that made my architectural mind snap in two. I was standing inside the service corridors depicted on Blackwood's blueprints, the hidden spaces between the walls. But it wasn't a narrow 2-foot passage. It was a vast, labyrinthine network of intersecting hallways, stretching out in impossible directions. Up was down, left was right. The corridors twisted like a Mobius strip. Some hallways ended in sudden drops into darkness. As I walked, the walls began to change. The rocking horses gave way to something else. Framed photographs. Thousands of them, covering the walls floor to ceiling. I stopped, bringing the lantern closer. They lined the interior of the sphere, leading to nowhere, leading to everywhere. In the dead center of the sphere, suspended in mid-air by thick, rusted iron chains that anchored to the ceiling, floor, and walls, was a perfect, glowing replica of the glass-walled Seattle apartment. It hung there like a terrarium. Inside, bathed in a warm, synthetic light, I could see the sleek, modern furniture, the espresso machine on the counter, the pristine white rug. And standing in the center of the living room, her back to me, was Elena. She was wearing the trench coat she left in. She was holding one of the 3 immaculate leather suitcases. "Elena?" I called out, my voice cracking, echoing off the thousands of doors. She didn't turn around, but she spoke. Her voice was crystal clear, completely free of the metallic rasp. "You built glass walls, Artie," she said softly, her voice carrying across the impossible void. "Because you wanted everyone to see that you had nothing to hide. But the truth is, you built them so you wouldn't have to look at the hollow space inside yourself. You wanted the city to fill it for you." "Elena, please," I begged, stepping closer to the edge of the piano key corridor. The drop below me into the spherical chamber was bottomless. "I'm sorry. I know I was empty. I know I failed." "You came here to die, Arthur," she said, finally turning her head slightly, though I still couldn't see her face. "You bought a grave because you were already a ghost." The sphere shuddered. A massive, deafening groan echoed through the chamber, the sound of tearing metal and snapping wood. The thousands of doors lining the walls suddenly began to burst open. The sound of the shattering glass was deafening, a physical force that knocked me backward onto the piano keys. The warm light was extinguished instantly. I lay there, stunned, ears ringing, as the debris of the apartment, the swarm and the colossus began to slowly revolve in the center of the sphere, forming a vortex of absolute destruction. I looked down at my hand, gripping the dying lantern. The skin was pale, almost translucent. I could see the veins beneath, dark and sluggish. The house wasn't just killing me. It was absorbing me. It was breaking me down into architectural material. I had to find the center. Blackwood's blueprints, the hollow. If the house had a throat, it had to have a heart. I forced myself up, ignoring the terrifying vortex spinning in the center of the sphere. I looked around the endless doors. One of them had to lead out of the service corridors. One of them had to lead to the true basement. I closed my eyes, trying to visualize the blueprints I had seen in the attic. The main staircase was a lie. The secondary staircase bypasses the second floor. I opened my eyes and looked at a door directly to my right, halfway down the curve of the sphere. It was an unassuming, heavy, iron-reinforced door, exactly like the one at the end of the kitchen hallway, the door to the basement. I didn't think about the physics of jumping across the void. I just ran. I sprinted down the piano key corridor, the keys shrieking under my boots, and launched myself into the empty air toward the iron door. I didn't jump with the grace of a stuntman. I threw myself into the impossible expanse of the spherical chamber with the frantic desperation of a drowning man. The piano keys screamed beneath my boots as I launched into the freezing, ozone-choked air. But the stones weren't bound by cement. They were mortared with a thick, calcified paste of gray ash. In the geometric center of the cavern hung the culmination of Blackwood's mad design, an inverted pyramid of polished black obsidian, its point aiming directly downward at a perfectly circular chasm in the bedrock. I walked to the edge of the pit. It was filled with the detritus of human lives, suitcases, pocket watches, eyeglasses, and among them, perfectly preserved in the freezing air, were the people. They were mummified in a gray crust, their faces locked in expressions of absolute, vacant apathy. They were the load-bearing souls, the broken people absorbed into the foundation to keep the impossible geometry from collapsing. Suddenly, a voice resonated from the obsidian pyramid itself, smooth, cultured, yet bottomlessly desperate. The strongest building material on Earth is not steel, Mr. Pendleton, E. Blackwood's voice echoed. It is human sorrow. It is dense. It does not yield. You built a parasite, I yelled, my voice thin in the massive space. I built a resonator, the voice countered. When I lost my family in 1890, the hollow inside me was structurally unsound. You cannot fill that void with time. I built this house to draw in the empty ones. Together, our apathy forms a perfect, unbreakable arch. The heavy iron chains shrieked as the obsidian pyramid began to lower toward the pit. The geometry is unstable, Arthur, Blackwood continued softly. It needs your specific, exquisitely crafted emptiness. You let your marriage die because you preferred the void to the effort of living. Artie, don't fight it, a new voice bled in. It was Elena's, drifting up from the pit. One of the ashen faces shifted, molding into her features. It's so quiet down here. Just let the ceiling fall. The pressure was excruciating. My nose began to bleed. If that pyramid touched the pit, the circuit would close. I would be dragged down, becoming just another brick in this monument to misery. I dropped to my knees. The fight was bleeding out of me. replaced by a seductive lethargy. I had bought this house because I didn't want to exist anymore. It was offering exactly what I came for. But as my architectural mind prepared to shut down, a fundamental rule of structural engineering sparked in the darkness. A structure entirely dependent on tension will shatter if introduced to dynamic resistance. Blackwood's machine was fueled by surrender, by passive acceptance. I didn't have to be whole to defeat it. I just had to refuse to be its mortar. I wasn't going to surrender to the grief. I was going to get angry at it. I am empty, I growled, pushing myself to my feet. My marriage failed, but that is my emptiness, Blackwood. It belongs to me. It is not your building material. I scanned the cavern in the sickly light, looking for the structural flaw. Every building has one. My eyes locked onto a rusted iron stanchion wedged diagonally between the floor and the ceiling, right next to the pit. It was the only piece of metal in the foundation, the grounding wire. The pyramid was 3 feet from the pit. The psychic gravity was a hurricane. I sprinted toward the stanchion, diving for a heavy, corroded crowbar lying in a puddle near its base. I hauled myself up, wedged the flattened end into the microscopic fissure beneath the iron beam, and threw my entire body weight against it. "Break!" I roared, using every ounce of leverage and spite I possessed. With a sound like a cannon shot, the rusted iron stanchion snapped. The architectural circuit shorted out. The descending obsidian pyramid violently slammed upward into the stone ceiling, shattering into a million jagged pieces of black glass. The house screamed, the sound of non-Euclidean geometry violently snapping back into reality. The subterranean cathedral began to implode. I dropped the crowbar and ran. The implosion had blown the heavy door open, revealing the wooden steps. I vaulted up them as the foundation crumbled to dust behind me. I burst into the kitchen hallway. The house was tearing itself apart, the walls catching fire, the floorboards heaving like a stormy sea. I sprinted through the collapsing foyer, slammed my shoulder against the front door, and tumbled out onto the porch. I scrambled into the freezing mud of the driveway, throwing myself down just as the main structure of the Blackwood House caved in on itself with a deafening roar. A massive cloud of ancient dust rose into the Oregon canopy. Then there was only the quiet hush of the rain. I lay in the mud, bleeding and soaked. The brooding gargoyle was gone. In its place was a smoking pile of ordinary timber and shattered stone. The trap was broken. I dragged myself to my Jeep, my hands trembling as I turned the ignition. I drove away without ever looking in the rearview mirror. I am back in Seattle now. I live in a smaller apartment with solid beige walls, no glass. I design small, functional spaces now. I survived the Blackwood House, but I didn't walk away unscathed. Elena was right. There is a hollow inside of me. Defeating the house didn't miraculously fill it. The empty space is still there. But I understand it now. As an architect, I know that not every space needs to be filled. Sometimes a void is just a void. You just have to build the rest of your life around it, ensuring the frame is strong enough to support the structure. I don't try to fill it anymore. I just make sure the doors to that room stay securely locked. Because sometimes, late at night when it rains, I swear I can catch the faintest whiff of ozone. And if I press my ear to the plaster, I can hear a faint, metallic scratching, echoing from the place that no longer exists.